Hi, my name is Stephen Kirsting, and once again it is time for the monthly theme critique. And January's theme was separation of the background using wide apertures. I said it's not really a shallow depth of field assignment because aperture is just one aspect of the three factors which control depth of field. But most of the images here do have shallow depth of field, which is to be expected. System I'm going to use is going to be a little different this month, being that it's more of a technical consideration, and I'm not going to do a lot of editing. I probably won't do any editing. All the images submitted do meet the theme requirement. There was no specific aperture requirement other than it was the widest the lens you used was capable of. Artistic and aesthetic considerations are less significant for this assignment, but I may mention them. And then technical considerations are going to be the primary thing we're going to look at this month. And a lot of the images have issues of bokeh. They all have shallower depths of field, but the bokeh tends to have issues at wide apertures, and lenses tend to be not as sharp at wide apertures. So that's what we're going to look at primarily. And I'm going to forego grading of images for this assignment. Alright, the first image we have is by Paul. It's a fairly small image. It's taken with a 35mm at f1.8, ISO 100 and 1/120th of a second. And I'm going to assume, because it's a rather tight macro-ish type image, that the smaller image size is due to cropping. And we can look and see that very shallow depth of field and not great sharpness. Even at ISO 100, there's a little bit of noise in the background. This stuff here, speckling, I'm going to guess was not in the raw image and was due to processing. And depth of field, in sharpness is just, well, first, the very shallow depth of field has placed probably the most important part of the subject, the fly, out of focus, the fly's eyes. And even where it is in focus, it's not terribly in focus. Bokeh considerations, overall they don't look too bad as far as smoothness and other considerations, and that's largely due to the background being fairly large in detail and not specular as such. So for this image, I would call this a good bokeh, but definitely would benefit from more depth of field and a sharper aperture. And that's to be expected with this assignment. The next image we have is by Dave, and it's a 70-300 variable zoom at 300mm, ISO 3200, f5.6 1/30th of a second. And take a look in here. Definitely a lot of noise in the background, easily dealt with, and because it's in the background, it's not as big a factor. And we're definitely suffering from a lack of sharpness, and I actually think that is more due to the shutter speed of 1/30th of a second and the long focal length, high magnification, as opposed to the lens itself. So I can't really comment on the lens IQ. I think technique wise, shutter speed needed to be higher, tripod, something is amiss because there's nothing really in focus. Being that it's a smaller aperture, we would expect the bokeh characteristics to be better than they might be at a wider aperture. So I can't really see anything of a negative. Another image by Dave. This time we have similar settings, a little better shutter speed than the last, and It looks like noise is a little less problematic. It's here in the higher highlight areas. Could be addressed. Can't tell if those might be a few hot pixels or not. I wouldn't worry about it. Once again, not as sharp as it should be. And here we have a little more of what I would call background separation. Here we have what I would consider more to be background and some separation. We can see that the transition of the edges is smooth. There's not any significant doubling or chromatic aberration type issues that we'll see in some of the other images taken at wider apertures. Next image is by Joaquin, and it's two cups and the background, and we have, let's see, a 100mm macro wide open at f2.8, 1/20th of a second. The image is sharp, and here we're seeing a little bit of a harsh transition. I actually think that's a catch light or the edge of the glass highlight causing that double edge in this portion. In the background, it looks smooth overall. Noise is not significant at the low ISO. Still a little noisy. Could be treated easily. And it definitely, like I said, looks sharp. The background maybe is not blurry enough, but we definitely have separation of the subject, midground, and background, providing depth to this image. So overall, I think this is well done, and that lens has relatively good bokeh characteristics. You can see on the edge just a slight bit of what might be doubling. Overall, I like that image, although subject wise, lighting wise, I think I would like this cup to glow more, similar to this one. We have an image by Steve. Let's see, we're talking a 24 to 70 2.8 at 70 and 2.8, ISO 400, black and white transition, and it's a relatively close image. Got a bit of noise in here, perhaps sharpening. It definitely looks like it's been sharpened relatively heavily, and very shallow depth of field. We've got depth of field placement looks to be a bit off to me. It seems to be here on the bridge of the nose as opposed to on the eyes. And just losing the tip of the nose as far as sharpness goes. Maximum sharpness seems to be right in here, not quite far enough back for the eyes, and of course working with shallow depths of field, that's always problematic. Can't really speak much about bokeh characteristics because the background is so plain that there's not really any bokeh characteristics to talk about. One thing I would suggest here is that sharpening, if you're going to do sharpening such as this, it be done more selectively using the brush tool or in Photoshop as opposed to overall, and then you can avoid the background noise and the sharpening in these edges and areas where it's not really benefiting the image at all. But I like the image. Technique wise, biggest thing is focus placement. Select your focus point on the eye and then recompose if you need to with shallow depth of field. That slight amount of recomposition should not cause a problem. All right, next image is by MJ, and we have, let's see, 35 at f1.8, ISO 200, 1/1000th of a shutter speed. And let's take a look at the depth of field placement. Looks to be right in this area, which should be about this eye. It looks to be relatively sharp, even wide open, which is very nice. You can make out individual eyelashes and details in the iris. Plenty of light in there. Overall nice image. And if we look in the background, the bokeh looks to be pretty good. Maybe a bit busy. Looks to be a bit busy, and there's a bit of color noise back here in the background. These reds, speckles could be dealt with color noise reduction pretty easily. Overall, the 35 1.8 is not a great lens wide open as far as bokeh characteristics go. It tends to be a bit busy, has a bit of doubling, and in the one image you took of the rooster, it's not in here, that image, the grass really looks kind of jittery, and that's due to the busy characteristic, and that would go away when this lens is stopped down, which will be the next month's February's assignment, or I guess this month's assignment. Overall, I like this image. I think it's well composed, well lit, well focused, and the background has been reduced to the point, even though it's a bit busy and jittery, it's been reduced in impact to the point where it doesn't really matter. So nice job on that image. Here we have an image by Brad, and again we're going to see not terribly sharp, got a bit of green chromatic aberration going on in here due to the backlighting. That can be treated relatively easily. So let me go down here and we'll take out some of that green. So that gets rid of that green. There's a little bit of purple in this area as well, so we can pull that out. I don't know if you can see it as well here. And these are relatively minor, but they're easily dealt with. So that gets rid of all the chromatic aberrations in the image. It's not as sharp, and that's again characteristic of a lens used wide open. And 50mm 1.8, low ISO, so good noise characteristics. Overall, I like this image. I can't talk a lot about the bokeh characteristics of this lens in this image. And, you know, I'm not sure what those white spots are, but those could be easily removed with a spot correction tool. Overall, like this image, we've reduced the other factors, components of the image in out of focus enough that they add to the feeling without detracting from the subject or the point of focus. So they add a little bit of context because they're not so out of focus. So overall, I like this image. Here we have an image with more specular type highlights in the background. And this is where bokeh characteristics really start to show. So one of the main factors with bokeh, or the characteristic of the out of focus, is the background itself. Not all backgrounds are going to cause bokeh to be a factor. In this image we have a bit of doubling. You can see that you've got the darker edges and there's a bit of what is cat eye. Closer to the edge of the frame, the circular speculars are not circular. They're more oblong, and that's due to vignetting of the lens itself. all that would go away at a smaller aperture. So this lens, while it does have round bokeh, relatively good bokeh characteristics, it suffers from a bit of chromatic aberration. It's a failure of correction for chromatic aberration to be ideal, which causes these light or dark rings on the bokeh speculars. And then it has a bit of vignetting wide open, which causes the cat eye characteristic. And if we look back in here, we do have what just looks to be a bit of chromatic aberration, maybe. I would guess it does. And again, not incredibly sharp wide open. And perhaps this image has been over sharpened trying to compensate for that, because this just looks a bit harsh and doesn't really help that much. So once again, this lens is going to perform better, stop down a couple stops, which is a characteristic of almost every lens. So around f4, 5.6, this lens is going to be doing probably its best. And the cat eye, doubling, chromatic aberration issues will all go away. Overall, I like the color, and I particularly like this right here where it kind of looks like a sun behind branches of a tree kind of thing. But overall, the image is just suffering. All right, next image by Adrian again. And here we can see more of the specular type characteristics of this lens, the 50mm 1.8, and we can see that it's suffering from vignetting, causing the speculars to not be circular. It also looks to be a little on the busy side, almost like it's doing some doubling. And then these characteristics here are not particularly smooth as far as the out of focus quality. Over here it looks better, but still a little busy. And then we have some doubling. You can see that this specular, this would be chromatic failure for chromatic aberration corrections, and this looks like it's doubling up. So again, this lens is what I would call busy, and the bokeh characteristics wide open are not great, and the sharpness wide open is not great either. So you have f1.8, but unless you really need the shutter speed, I would not be using f1.8. Now that's not to say that, you know, speculars are always a factor or maximum sharpness is always a factor. And for this image, perhaps having the background out of focus is more important than the other IQ issues, but for me, in this case, it's not. We've gotten the bottle out of focus, but not enough. It's either too much or not enough. It's too much out of focus to where it's drawing attention. I want to know what it is, but it's not enough in focus that it's supporting the subject. So this image, the distance between the subject and the background, the bottle, is either not great enough or too great. And that's what we're going to look at with February's assignment, controlling background separation by controlling distances. So for this image, I think the distance for the background needed to be changed one way or the other. All right. Here we have an image by Heather. We're 50mm 1.8 at ISO 200 1/2000. And this image has a greater depth of field because it's a looser composition. So the subject distance is a little greater than a lot of the other images, so therefore the depth of field is going to be greater. And It's done a good job of causing the background to fall out of focus, but it falls out gradually over a greater distance, leaving more context. So this, I know what it is, but it's not distracting. It's supporting the image because it's more of the rail, which is, we can consider these wires as leading lines. I would consider them to be leading into the image, but since it's so out of focus, it really brings me to here and brings me back to here, our point of focus. So compositionally and depth of field use for this image, I think has worked very well. And the only thing I think might benefit would be darken this side a little further to reduce its impact. My attention wants to go there and it's a little busy. So I'd either reduce the darkness or I'd lighten the darkness so that when I do look there, it's not bothering me as much. I can see a little more. But overall, I like this. I think I'd just probably bring up the shadows a bit. Noise wise, I would expect it low. We've got a good amount of chromatic aberration going on here. It's mostly in the purple, so again we can remove that. Just bump that up. And that should go away. Looks like it's moved into the blue. We're not going to fix that doubling characteristic there. Not sure what this halo characteristic is right there, or what caused that. That might be processing, because let me turn this off. Maybe it's chromatic aberration. I don't know exactly what's causing that, but I would expect whatever that is would go away with the lens stop down. So bokeh characteristics, not a big factor in this image. Shallow depth of field use, but the bokeh characteristics are not optimal wide open. It would be better stop down. In stop down about 2 stops, your depth of field would only increase. Take a quick guess here. We've got about, let's say that's 6 inches depth of field. So if you stop down 2 stops, it'd go to about 2 foot. So it'd go from here to here or so and then fall off, which would still work well for this image. So contrary to the assignment, the image overall I think would benefit from a smaller aperture, which is typical. Here we have an image by Karen, and this month Karen actually submitted 3 images, and I left them all in because they're all a little different and they all have something different to talk about. So here we have a 35mm f1.8 ISO 200, 1/13 of a second. Definitely on the slow side, but it looks sharp, so I'm going to assume a tripod was used. And this has a lot of nice characteristics with it. The depth of field is placed well. It's right here on the eye. We have the whiskers mostly in focus, the face mostly in focus where we want it, and falling off here and in the background. A shallow depth of field is not as shallow as it would be, as this is something of a looser composition due to the wider focal length, and it has caused the background to not fall off so far as to be unidentifiable. We know what this is. We've got the fireplace, the bricks, I can see it all. The slower shutter speed has caused the flames to blur nicely, and so it all supports the warm, happy kitten taking a nap type idea here. So it has all worked well and is done well. Characteristics in the background, a little bit of noise, and some of that's just going to happen because it's dark. Got a little bit of fringing here. That's due to being wide open. But all in all, at this with this background, I would say the bokeh characteristics are pretty decent, and that's largely due to the background itself. Here's the other image by Karen, and I wanted to look at this one. Here we're seeing a very shallow depth of field, 50 millimeter 1.8, and a lack of maximum sharpness. Even though the shutter speed was high, the higher magnification of a short distance, longer focal length makes that more challenging. I don't know if a tripod was used, but I almost think it was not. But more important, I wanted to talk about these bokeh characteristics. You can see the circles are not circular towards the edge. That's vignetting. And in this case, as opposed to the previous one I talked about, this has bright edges. Now it's only on the inside because it's being cut off by vignetting on the right side. But if it was in the center, it would be all the way around. And that is, again, a chromatic aberration failure to correct for. So it's a chromatic aberration type issue where the out of focus spectrums of light don't line up together on the focal plane. Sometimes when a lens is corrected for chromatic aberrations for the in focus portions to get all the different wavelengths in focus, it actually makes the out of focus wavelengths worse. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. Again, that would improve stop down, the vignetting would go away, the hard edges would go away, and some of the busyness would go away, but the depth of field would increase. And this would be the third image, and I left it as just another example of the shallow depth of field being used, placed very well on the subject. The background is not so far out of focus that we don't know what it is, but it's gone to the point of being a little distracting. Overall, it's supporting the image, but it's gone to being a little bit distracting due to the doubling up characteristics here of the bokeh and out of focus edges. So it's made it a bit busy, which makes it a bit distracting as far as that goes. So once again, maybe this image would benefit from this being a little more in focus and less separated, contrary to the assignment. So we're talking the same lens throughout these images, I believe. No, that's a 35, which has worked a little better with more depth of field but greater background distance, as opposed to the 50 millimeter in a more of a macro type setup, which has a little worse bokeh characteristics when it's absolutely wide open and the background is contributing to the bokeh. Alright, here we have an image by Brian, and I stole this off of Flickr. It's 116 millimeter at f4.8. It's a variable aperture zoom, so at 116 I'm going to assume that's wide open. 1/320th, ISO of 320 and 1/40th of a second. A dark background, we could expect to have some noise in it, just as a matter of fact. I do not think this is bokeh as such. It's just, there's something there in the image that is out of focus and a bit distracting. I think, this stuff here could have been removed from the image. The stove or whatever this is behind there doesn't really hurt so much as far, but this line right here kind of does, so maybe a little different angle to place that line higher and out of the frame. Bokeh characteristics, we have a little bit of vignetting, and we have a little bit of the chromatic aberration bright edge issue, but it's not bad in that we would expect it to be better stop down, because this lens, like I said, it's an f4 at 55 millimeters, it's an f5.6 at 200. So at f4 I would expect it to be a little worse, and I would expect it to be better at 200 and f5.6 than it is here, but it's not bad at all. As far as the shallow depth of field separating the background. It's worked well here, but here it hasn't, because this has become busy, almost distracting. And it's not because the bokeh is bad, it's because if you take something that's busy and you make it out of focus, then it just becomes busy and large. And that's kind of what's happened here. So it's not really contributing, and that part hasn't worked well. This is out of focus enough to not be distracting, but I know what it is and it suits the situation well enough. This should be gone, that should be gone, that should be gone. And then for the focus, it's not terrible. And we're at f4.8, so I would expect it. It's still wide open. It's not terrible. I can almost make out some brush detail, but nothing's crisp. A little bit of noise is probably, detracting from the image. And I use a rule of thumb in estimating depth of field. 1 + 1 is 2. So 100 millimeters from 10 feet has 2 foot of depth of field. And that's at f16 for an APS sensor. If you have the aperture, it becomes half the depth of field. So at f8, this would be 1 foot, and at f4, it would be 6 inches. And then when you half the distance, you cut the depth of field by 1/4, and the EXIF said this was taken at about 7.5 feet or so. So instead of 1/4, it's going to be half. So we're looking at around a 3-inch depth of field for this image, and it doesn't quite come across because of a lack of sharpness overall at the maximum aperture. It looks to me like it's about from the front of the orange to about the back. So somewhere in that, it goes to the tomato, almost to the front of that orange. But it's really hard to judge because not really in focus. And I think if I were to judge this, I would want the tomato and the orange more in focus, and these back tomatoes less in focus. Alright, next image is by Marcy, and this is another case of taking a background, making it out of focus, and it being, in my opinion, detrimental to the image. In my opinion, all the speculars back here have become busy and detracted from the image. I think the background kisses moved closer to where we could make out more of them, and they were not as out of focus, would keep them complementary to the subject, give them enough context that I knew what they were, and they'd be less busy because they'd be less out of focus, and or go much further separation so that they're more out of focus. It's another thing of, you take specular busyness and distractions and make them larger, then they just become busier or more distracting. Focus wise, it's acceptable, it's adequate. A bit noisy, not as sharp as it should be. A lot of chromatic aberration here, a lot of this purple, which again, easy to fix. Well, you can take the purple out, but you can't fix the offset. So when we get rid of that purple, actually that looks like it's further into the red. So we can take it out, we make it a different color, but it doesn't actually go away. It's still there. It's just a different color that's not as distracting. Quite a bit of noise in the dark areas to be expected. Looks like a higher ISO was probably used. So all in all, again, I think this smaller apertures would benefit. This lens isn't doing that great at wide apertures as far as bokeh characteristics. The speculars do look to be a bit smoother overall, a little bit of lateral offset there, and a bit of chromatic aberration as we saw. So this lens, again, stop down, at least one stop, maybe two, is probably where this lens is its best. Not sure what's going on over here on the upper right edge. Not sure what this red is bleeding into our highlights. The red itself is out of focus enough, but it's a different color than everything else, doesn't really go and is bleeding in. So background choice maybe. Here's another image by Marcy, and here it's worked much better. We don't have as specular highlights, so the bokeh characteristics are not as significant. They're not really impacting the image as much. Bokeh characteristics aren't really a major factor because the background doesn't impact in the same way. It doesn't have the same characteristics, so the bokeh doesn't matter as much. And again, a little noisy, a little bit of doubling, a little bit of chromatic aberration. Here we're seeing it in the greens. Focus wise, as expected, not as sharp as we would like. But overall, I think this has worked a little better than the previous image. Here we have an image by Ian, and let's see, it was a 50mm f1.4, ISO 100, 1/100th of a second. Stole this off of Flickr. Alright, and here we're seeing the bokeh characteristics of speculars. We got the bright edges, not terribly smooth gradient across, and that's just a characteristic of a less than perfect lens, which they all are, at maximum aperture. The depth of field is very shallow. I think too shallow for me. In here at the subject, I would like it to go a little further back, so a little looser composition, and then it could be cropped if this is the composition you want, but looser framing initially, or greater subject distance to increase the depth of field, to bring it back in here a little further and make this a little less busy. All the numbers have gone out of focus. I'm assuming they're numbers. Whatever it is that's indicating the time has gone to specular bokeh characteristics. A bit of doubling up going on there. Some of the times the doubling, I think, is caused by light actually reflecting off the sensor back onto an objective element, perhaps the focusing element nearest to the sensor. So it causes a double image kind of effect. I'm not entirely certain what causes this doubling of bokeh at wide apertures in all cases, but I think that might be what contributes. The image isn't that large, I can't judge it very critically. It looks to have a bit of noise, not as sharp, but sharp enough. So I'm going to guess this is already a crop. Certainly a crop because it's a square format. And I think if I were to do this, I would have composed this in a portrait orientation vertically with some more negative space at the top. I just feel like it's a little crowded, and I don't tend to personally like square compositions as much. Centered compositions I use a lot, but I don't use square compositions that much. And I think that a little more room at the top would give this a little more of a relaxed feel to offset some of the busyness that's going on here. Alright, we've got a 50mm 1.4 at 1/125th and 200mm. Very shallow depth of field due to the long, ISO 200. It's a 50mm. A very shallow depth of field, and in this case I think it's worked pretty well. The background does not have specular characteristics, so the bokeh does not become as busy and distracting. A little bit of what I would call doubling of edges, but it's not, it's more out of focus to where it's less of an impact. So that's worked well. It's got enough here that I know what it is, so that contributes to the image. This portion here looks like shelf, which I think is not contributing. So compositionally, I think moving the book, the subject book up higher to hide that, and including perhaps more books above instead of cropping them off might work better. And as far as subject goes and focus, again, it's not maximum. It's a bit noisy. I don't know if sharpening has contributed to that, and I don't know why. I like this in focus, but I don't like this in focus. So compositionally, again, I think I would have shifted this over to where these words came to be the ones that were the point of focus or the subject of the image. Because it has enough interest to it and leading into the story, but it goes out of focus. It's kind of like a teaser to the book itself in the story that's going on in the book. So compositionally, center this more, focus on this more, and get rid of some of this, get rid of some of that, and I might even in post take some of that out of focus. Not so much that it becomes obviously fake, but I might knock some of that down a little bit more so that really the point of interest is right here. Overall, this has worked better than the previous image. White balance, it's a little yellow, warm, indoor incandescent lighting that you could leave it that way. I'd probably lighten it up a bit. See, we're pretty heavy towards this side, but that also gives to the library aspect. So aesthetic, personal choices. I would probably lighten it up a little bit as far as the whites go. Alright, that is the last image for this month's submissions, and one takeaway from this is depth of field or shallow depth of field is not bokeh. Bokeh characteristics are these kind of considerations, and the type of background or choice of background really affects the results you're going to get. And then the bokeh characteristics also change with how far out of focus things are. So it's choice of background, and if a less than ideal bokeh characteristic is going to contribute, such as it does in this image, but does not in this image, or not as significantly in this image. So choice of background, background distance, and placement are both more significant factors than bokeh characteristics as such. And then the lack of sharpness of lenses wide open. So the takeaway from this is almost all of the images, almost all of the characteristics of the wide aperture has been, in the most part, somewhat detrimental or more detrimental than having stopped down a stop or two would have been. And of course that was the point of the assignment. Now you can stop down a stop or two and still have shallow depth of field, and you can still throw a background far out of focus by controlling how close the background is, and that is what we're going to look at with the February assignment. So I'm expecting sharper images, better bokeh characteristics, and still having good background separation, even though we're using a smaller aperture for the next month's assignment. Alright, till next month, when I see you again, have a great day.